Hey there YouTube, this is a video that is with respect to the thesis that Muhammad was demon possessed. Now, in this presentation I'm going to give a biblical case for Muhammad's demonic possession. I'm going to compare Muhammad's condition as found in the Quran, Hadith, and Muslim literature to the biblical description of demonic possession. And we're going to line them up side by side to see if Muhammad fits that description. In doing so, my purpose in doing so is to give argumentation and data to the Christians to edify them. For anybody who is struggling in between deciding which religion to follow, either Islam or Christianity, I hope this information will be helpful to persuade people not to follow Islam. And for the Muslims who do not really know these issues, and who just blindly follow Muhammad, I would exhort you to pay careful attention to this material and seriously consider these things, because these are, of course, eternal issues. And to the Muslims who do know these issues, the apologists, I would exhort you to examine these things as well and not just give a blind eye to these issues. Now, when investigating historical material, we want to go to the earliest sources, okay? And the earliest source, the earliest biographical work on Muhammad's life, full biography, is from Ibn Ishaq, who was an 8th century Muslim historian, who wrote the work Sirat Rasulullah, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the life of Muhammad. And in this work, with respect to Muhammad's encounter with spirit beings near the beginning of his supposed prophethood, we see some interesting information that's germane to our thesis. In the Life of Muhammad, page 71-72, this is what we read. 2 men clothed in white have seized that Quraysh brother of mine and thrown him down, and opened up his belly and are stirring him up. We ran towards him and found him standing up with a livid face. We took hold of him and asked him what was the matter. He said, 2 men with white raiment came and threw me down. The same source goes on to say, when she asked if I feared a demon possessed him, I replied that I did. So notice 2 things. Notice that extremely early witnesses of Muhammad and his behavior after his encounter with these spirit beings, these extremely early witnesses believed Muhammad, or suspected that Muhammad was under demonic possession. Okay, so this is valuable early historical testimony from the earliest Muslim biography demonstrating that this is so. Moreover, notice also that one of the things the demons do, right, is throw people down to the ground. It says the demons, or the 2 men in white, threw him down. These were angelic entities. Threw him down to the ground. Now, it's interesting that in the Holy Scriptures, if you read the totality of the Tanakh, the Torah, and the New Testament, you will never see true angels from God throwing people down to the ground forcefully. Never. That's never done. But what we do find in the Christian and Jewish Scriptures is that this is something that the demons do. Throw people down to the ground. For example, in Luke 9:32, we read the following. While he was coming, the demon threw him to the ground and convulsed him. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. So notice, Muhammad's condition does not fit with true prophets in this regard, since none of the true prophets were ever thrown to the ground by angels. But what Muhammad's condition does fit are incidents like this demon-possessed boy who was thrown to the ground by this demon who was possessing him. Again, nowhere do real angels possess people and throw them down violently and things like this. Now, when we read the parallel account in Mark 9:20, this is what it says. The demon convulsed the boy. He fell to the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Now again, when we take the historical principle and look to the Muslim literature, we see that there's early Muslim traditions that talk about Muhammad foaming from the mouth and things like this, similar to what happened to this demon-possessed boy. In one source, we read in the True Guidance and Introduction to Quranic Studies, page 9, it reports some ancient traditions. And here's one. It says, another account says he became distressed, foaming at the mouth, in reference to Muhammad, foaming at the mouth, and closing his eyes. At times he snorted like a young camel. Now, the similarity is getting quite striking. When I was researching this material, I was shocked at how similar the biblical description of possession is to the historical information concerning Muhammad. Another ancient tradition, as reported by the book The Misnan ul-Huk, page 345 and 346 says, in tradition it is stated, again this is Muslim literature, in tradition it is stated that he said, I fear lest I should become a magician, lest one should proclaim me a follower of the jinn, which are the demons, and again I fear lest there should be madness or demonic possession in me. After an ascension of shivering and shutting his eyes, there used to come over him what resembled a swoon. His face would foam. It goes on to say, in tradition it is stated that he was troubled thereat, and his face would foam, and he closed his eyes, and perchance roared like the roaring of a young camel. And so here in this early Muslim literature, we see a direct parallel to what happened to this demon-possessed boy in Luke 9:32, in that Muhammad would be thrown to the ground. This possessed boy would be thrown to the ground. Muhammad would foam from his mouth or his face. This possessed boy would foam from his mouth and his face. So the similarities are quite striking. Moreover, in the Muslim literature, we read that Muhammad would sweat profusely. This is in Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 1, book 1, number 2. We also know that he would turn red and breathe heavily. This is in Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, book 61, number 508. And so therefore one can see the similarity quite clearly. Now that's not all. There's other information with respect to Muhammad again falling down in this convulsive way. We read in Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 4, book 54, number 461, that Muhammad was so frightened, he was gripped with such fear that he would fall to the ground. It says, I was so frightened by him, this angelic entity, that I fell on the ground and came to my family and said to them, cover me with a blanket, cover me. So again, falling to the ground due to fear or due to being thrown by the demons was a repeated pattern in Muhammad's life, similar to what happened to possessed people in the Bible. Now, with respect to Muhammad's first encounter with this spirit being that he would later believe to be the angel Gabriel upon spurious grounds, this is what we read. A Christian monk named Waraka ben Nufail was sought out for his opinion about what had just transpired. And this testimony adds to the early case for Muhammad being possessed, as demonstrated by early Muslim literature. It states, I am afraid that it may be someone other than Gabriel, for certain devils imitate him, and by doing so can mislead and corrupt some men. This is in Ibn Kathir's Life of Muhammad. Ibn Kathir being one of the major tafsirs or commentators of Islam. So this is Muslim literature, not Christian literature. And so what we get from this early testimony, again, in the Muslim sources, is that after Muhammad's experience with this spirit being, who the Muslims would later believe to be Gabriel, people who were around this situation were suspicious that this wasn't Gabriel, but that this was a demonic being imitating Gabriel. And Waraka ben Nufail, in his suspicion, he was correct, since 2 Corinthians 11:14 states, and no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So there's the biblical reference of warning. And you can see this in history too. I document this in my article. You can see this with respect to Joseph Smith, the false prophet of Mormonism, and how he believed he was in contact with God, or a righteous angel named Moroni, but in actuality, since his message was completely contrary to that which is true, it is deduced that he was actually being talked to by a demonic being posing as a righteous angel. So this isn't unknown to history. It's also relevant to note that according to pre-Islamic Arabian belief, the poets who were talented at poetry, it was believed that they were influenced by the demons. And according to the early literature, these Arabian poets would in fact boast that they were helped by demons. We read about this from the 9th century Islamic historian and exegete al-Tabari, and this is what he says. The pre-Islamic Arabs believed in the demon of poetry, and they thought that a great poet was directly inspired by demons. That's in his work, The Last Years of the Prophet, page 167, note 1151. So notice, the early Arabian belief was that those who were good at poetry were inspired or possessed by the demons. Now it's interesting to then read in the Quran itself, for example in Surah 44, Ayah 14, Surah 37, Ayah 36, that there's early evidence that people were suspecting that Muhammad was under such demonic inspiration to be able to produce poetry. The accounts state, "Yet they turn away from him and say, tutored by others, a man possessed," in reference to Muhammad. Or, and say what? "Shall we give up our gods for the sake of a poet possessed?" The belief again that the poets were inspired by demons is brought out by the work of Alfred Felix Landon Beeston in his work Arabic Literature to the End of the Umayyad Period. He states, "The effort required of the poet to achieve all this at once is supreme. Hence the belief in the demon of poetry, or inspiration, as we would now term it. It was thought that the great bards of the Jahiliyyah were directly inspired by demons. Hassan, before he became a Muslim, boasted that he was helped by a companion of the children of Satan. One moment I speak, another he does. According to Al-Asha, his demon was called Jahannam, or Jahannam, hell. Sawaid B. Abi Kal describes his companion as devilish, quick," unquote. And so it's very interesting and telling then when we read more Islamic literature and find out that Muhammad believed firmly that he was one of these poets inspired by the demons, okay? So much so that he wanted to commit suicide. For example, in Al-Tabari's history we read, "I recited it, and then he desisted and departed. I woke up, and it was as though these words had been written on my heart. There was no one of God's creation more hateful to me than a poet or a madman. I could not bear to look at either of them. I said to myself, your humble servant, meaning myself, or meaning himself, is either a poet or a madman. But the Quraysh shall never say this of me. I shall take myself to a mountain crag, hurl myself down from it, kill myself, and find relief in that way." So notice, Muhammad wanted to commit suicide partially because he was persuaded that he was a poet or a madman, and he didn't want people talking about him with those terms. We read a similar account in Ibn Ishaq's Life of Muhammad, page 106. It says, "Now none of God's creatures was more hateful to me than an ecstatic poet or a man possessed. I could not even look at them. I thought, woe is me, poet or possessed." So Muhammad believed himself to be possessed by the demons of poetry. And I find that to be very interesting, since this isn't Christian literature. This is the early Muslim literature. Now, in the Holy Scriptures, there is no evidence whatsoever of true people of God, prophets or apostles, being concerned that they were possessed by the demons or by Satan. And there's no evidence that they thought that in going forth with their divine mission, that this was somehow a demonic mission that they were actually going on. In fact, what you actually find is that people who were actually possessed acknowledged their possession. True people of God didn't think about questioning if they were possessed. And so there's two classifications. There's the truly possessed people who acknowledge their possession, and then there's the people of God, the prophets and apostles, who never thought about questioning if they are possessed. So Muhammad does not fit into the classification of apostles and prophets here. He fits into the classification of those who are truly possessed. And we can see this, for example, in Matthew 8:28-29, where truly possessed people acknowledge their possession. Now, with respect to the biblical information, in 1 Samuel 16:14-15, because Samuel had disobeyed God, God withdrew his spirit from him and gave him a wicked spirit, and Saul became demonically possessed as a punishment. This is what we read in 1 Samuel 16:14-15. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servants said to him, Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. So as the punishment, Saul was given a harmful spirit and became demonically possessed. And when we look to the tormenting effects of this spirit, we read, for example, the first century Jewish historian Josephus in his work Antiquities of the Jews, and he states, when Saul came to him, he was disordered in mind. So again, these are the effects that the demonic possession had on Saul, King Saul. He was disordered in mind. He fell under vehement agitation of the spirit. Putting off his garments, he fell down and lay on the ground all night and day in the presence of Samuel and David. Now, when we look to these four descriptions of Saul's possession, we see that Muhammad suffered from each one of these things. For example, in Muhammad's first encounter with the spirit being who he would later believe to be Gabriel, but who I contend was either Satan or a demon, we see that Muhammad was vehemently agitated or choked by this harmful spirit, which is exactly what happened to Saul when he was possessed. In Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 1, Book 1, Number 3, the most authentic hadith collection, we read the following. The Prophet added, The angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it any more. He then released me and again asked me to read, and I replied, I do not know how to read. Thereupon he caught me again and pressed me a second time till I could not bear it out any more. This sounds like vehement agitation. He then released me again and asked me to read again a third time. I do not know how to read, or what shall I read? Thereupon he caught me for a third time and pressed me. Now in Al-Tabari we get a similar account. It states, Gabriel came to Muhammad and said, O Muhammad, recite. He said, I cannot recite. Gabriel was violent towards him, and then said again, O Muhammad, recite. He said, I cannot recite. And Gabriel again was violent towards him. So notice, like Saul, who was vehemently agitated by this demonic possession, Muhammad also in his first encounter was severely choked and was experiencing violence from this supposed angel. Nowhere in the scriptures do true angels act in violent ways towards true people of God. This is foreign to the true biblical text. It is also germane to note that in the Islamic sources, Muhammad's clothes fell to the ground. He was unconscious with his eyes upwards, similar to what happened to Saul. Again, in the account with Saul, we read that, and when Saul came to him, he was disordered in mind and under the vehement agitation of a spirit, putting off his garments, falling down. So notice, one of the things that the demons do is make sure that your clothes fall off and you fall to the ground. Well, we read in Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 5, Book 58, Number 170, that, quote, when the Kaaba was rebuilt, the Prophet and Abbas went to carry stones. Abbas said to the prophet, "Take off and put your waist sheet over your neck, so that the stones may not hurt you." But as soon as he took off his waist sheet, he fell unconscious on the ground, with both his eyes upwards, the sky. When he came to his senses, he said, "My waist sheet, my waist sheet." So we see a similarity there. And lastly, like Saul, Muhammad was extremely disordered in mind. That was the fourth thing. Or sorry, that was the first thing, that the demon would make sure that Saul was completely disordered in his mind. Now, it's well known, even according to Muslim scholars, that Muhammad was under bewitchment or witchcraft a lot of the time, that he would imagine that he was doing graphic things that he had not actually done. And so he was extremely disordered in mind to think that he had done things that he hadn't actually done. And we read about this not from Christian or Jewish sources again, but from the most reliable hadith collections. Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 7, book 71, number 660 says, narrated Aisha by his wife, magic was worked on Allah's apostle so that he used to think that he had sexual relations with his wives while he had not. So notice, Muhammad was bewitched under black magic, possessed, imagining that he would have sexual relations with his wives when nothing of the sort was even taking place. This is what happened to Saul, in that he was also disordered in mind. And there's numerous hadith citations with respect to this event. And so I think that the biblical description of possession fits Muhammad. Now, I want to talk about one last episode that is called the episode of the Satanic Verses. It is well known from texts like Deuteronomy 18:20 that those who are speaking things that aren't from God, but are from false gods or from their imaginations, they were to be put to death, because this was a sign that you were not working in accordance with godliness, but you were in fact doing something satanic. The account in Deuteronomy 18:20 states, "But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die." So notice, if a prophet preaches something, says it's from God, or if it's presupposed to be from God, and yet it's not from God, then that means he's a false prophet, and in ancient Israel he would be justly stoned to death, demonstrating that he's demonic. Now, it's interesting when we look to the early Muslim literature, and again, sources like Al-Tabari and others, Ibn Ishaq, we find that Muhammad delivered these verses from Satan, called the Satanic Verses. The Muslim sources admit this. Because Muhammad was concerned that his pagan tribe was against him, he was contemplating what he should do. And a verse came to him, which he believed to be from God, which gave validity to 3 pagan goddesses, identifying them as valid intercessors. So Muhammad was told to say, by the Spirit, that these 3 pagan gods were true, valid intercessors. We read the account in Al-Tabari. It states, "When the messenger of God saw how his tribe turned their backs on him, and was grieved to see them shunning the message he had brought to them from God, he longed his soul that something would come to him from God, which would reconcile him with his tribe. With his love for his tribe and his eagerness for their welfare, it would have delighted him if some of the difficulties which they made for him could have been smoothed out, and he debated within himself and fervently desired such an outcome. Then God revealed, by the star when it sets, your comrade does not err, nor is he deceived, nor does he speak out of his own desire. And when he came to the words, quote, have you thought upon Alat and Al-Usa and Manat, the third, the 3 pagan goddesses, the other, unquote, Satan cast on his tongue. This is the Muslim sources admitting this. Satan cast on his tongue, because of his inner debates and what he desired to bring to his people, the words, quote, these are the high-flying cranes. Verily their intercession is accepted with approval. Al-Tabari, page 108. So notice, Muhammad is saying that God Almighty is telling him that these three pagan goddesses are true and their intercession is accepted with approval. According to the warning in Deuteronomy, chapter 18:20, again, the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. This demonstrates that Muhammad was not of God, but according to the biblical standard, Muhammad belonged to Satan. And this account can be found in other Muslim literature, early literature. And so again, I think the case for Muhammad's demonic possession, and this is just a brief sketch, the case is very strong. And so it's not surprising then to see many Christians rejecting Muhammad, because Muslims will exhort Christians to leave Christianity, leave the first century gospel message, leave Jesus' actual teachings as recorded in the New Testament to follow Muhammad. It's not surprising to see Christians rejecting Muhammad and rejecting this Muslim exhortation, because according to our scriptures, Muhammad fits the description of demonic possession. So I would exhort the Muslims to, again, you can read this article at Answering Islam. I would exhort you to reject Muhammad, to embrace the true teachings of Jesus Christ, receive what Christ did for you by faith so that you can be justified and made right with God, stop following a works-based salvation and a false prophet who is possessed. And I just pray that this material will help lead you to the truth, because again, dying in your sin and following a false prophet who is possessed is not going to be good. It's going to be disastrous for your soul, eternally speaking. And so out of care and concern for the Muslims, I would exhort you to embrace the truth of Christianity and reject Muhammad. Christ has risen. He is Lord. Thank you.